Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. The sand was warm long before the sun rose, even at the final days of Carthage, as the Roman siege closed its jaws around the ancient city. The stone of Byrsa Hill radiated heat from within soft, old warmth. Not the burning kind, it's the slow kind, that had been accumulating for centuries. Byrsa had once been a hill of olive trees, before the temples, before the reservoirs, before the gold-trimmed porticos and marble columns. The soil here was considered sacred long before Carthage learned to fear Rome. Phoenician settlers came across the sea with jars of purple, dye, and papyrus scrolls. Had chosen this hill not for its height, but for its silence. The sea could be heard from here, not seen. It was a place for memory, not conquest. And in the 5th year of the siege, 146 BC, that silence was all that remained. No cries, no prayers, only the distant hiss of embers curling inward. At the center of Byrsa stood a temple, one of the last untouched by the flames. It had no grand spires or archways, no long columns or heroic inscriptions. It's just a low, square building of white limestone, older than most of the city around it. It's a kind of structure too plain to draw attention and too strong to fall quickly. The temple had once been dedicated to Tanit, but by the end, no priest dared speak her name aloud. Inside the temple was a single priest. His name was Tabdarish. That was not his birth name. No one used those anymore. After the 3rd year of siege, names became dangerous, something to be traded, betrayed, or buried. He was the last priest of Tanit, though the Romans didn't know it. And neither did most of the Carthaginians, who still wandered the alleys below the hill. He had not been chosen. He had stayed when others fled. That was enough. The temple had one main room bare, echoing, filled only with dust and the scent of old oil. There was a pit at its center, a shallow depression where once, centuries ago, offerings were burned. Not human. That was propaganda, mostly by Abderish's time. The pit was mostly symbolic. No fires had been lit here in over a year, not since the Romans blockaded the outer roads. There was no oil left, no incense, only the wind pressing through the broken shutters, carrying the sound of collapse from the lower city. Abderish sat beside the altar with a cloth, its bundle in his lap. He had unwrapped it 6 times in 3 days, wrapped it again, then buried it in sand beneath the floor, then unearthed it again. The bundle contained one object, a carved stone, round, flattened like a disc. On it, a symbol no longer taught, a name no longer spoken, the name of the city before. It was called Carthage. He remembered the name only because an old man once whispered it to him while showing how to grind ochre into paint. This name is not for the air, the man had said. It is only for the earth. And now, the earth was all that remained. Below Byrsa Hill, fires wandered the streets like forgotten soldiers. The lower quarters were already gone, hadn't burned, had been smashed. Roof beams blackened with soot, bent like reeds under the weight of stone. There were no defenders left, only mothers with dull blades, elderly scribes holding shattered styluses, children fed with water mixed with flour because grain was gone. And still, the priest waited. He believed not in rescue, but in preservation. If Rome was to take Carthage, then Carthage must take something with it, something it could hide. In a corner of the temple sat a clay amphora, old, plain, cracked along one side. Abderish had found it weeks earlier in a courtyard, filled with bone rye leaves. It had no decoration, no seal, a vessel meant to be overlooked. He'd repaired the crack with linen soaked in ash-water inside. He placed the stone and then something else, a handful of dried myrtle leaves, a coil of burnt thread, once used to bind a priestess's headdress, a strip of copper inscribed with 6 characters. He whispered each item's meaning as he placed them in, but he did not speak aloud. He was the last. The words would die with him when the temple began to shake, not from flames, but from the dull thud of impact. He took the jar, carried it outside, and walked past the altar, not down the steps, not toward the city. He walked toward the dust, toward the part of Byrsa where the ground broke unevenly, where ancient cisterns once captured rain, but now only held silence. He found a spot where the sand had settled into layers. He dug with a flat stone. Hours passed. He did not stop, and when the hole was wide enough to take the jar, he pressed it in not upright, but sideways, hidden within the contour of the hill's own breath. Then he covered it, not with earth, but with charcoal. He wanted it to be mistaken for a cooking pit, for nothing sacred at all. He wanted Rome to step over it. That was the last act of the last priest of Tenet. When they found him, he was seated beside the old altar, eyes open, hands folded. He was not burned, not pierced, just still. There were no signs of struggle, only a faint scent of smoke that did not come from fire. The Romans did not linger in the temple. They took what they thought was gold and left the rest. They brought down the buildings below the hill first, then the aqueducts, then the forums. But Byrsa held, until one soldier some months later decided the structure was too symbolic to remain. He ordered it dismantled, stone by stone, not by fire, but by forgetting. In the jar, no one noticed it. It lay in the dark, pressed into the hill, surrounded by dust and the discarded bones of birds. It did not contain gold, or secrets, or spells, only things a man believed needed silence. But why did he choose those objects? Why those symbols? And why bury them at all when the world was already burning? What did the last priest hope someone would remember? And more strangely did he believe someone eventually would. The temple was gone by the time spring arrived. Carthage, once a rival to Rome, had been leveled in layers its streets crushed under sand, key to aqueducts split like bone, and its stories scattered to the wind. Roman commanders issued their final orders with the same efficiency used for military drills. Reduce the city, erase the name, distribute the survivors, sow salt. But salt never reached Byrsa Hill. Not truly. The ritual was symbolic. Roman soldiers scattered some across the outer districts, more for morale than agriculture. No field was actually destroyed. The land would still bear grain under Roman rule. But the ceremony of obliteration had its uses, amans, something final. And so the world was told, Carthago delenda est, had become Carthago delenda est factum. Carthage was destroyed, yet not everything moved with fire. Some things resisted destruction by becoming too dull to notice. Like the amphora, tucked into the slope of Byrsa Hill, surrounded by burnt myrtle, crushed rock, and ash. Charcoal is rarely investigated, and Roman soldiers were not archaeologists. They were builders, repurposers, recorders of victories, not of symbols they didn't recognize. The amphora remained undisturbed, unclaimed. It had no inscription, no seal, no trap, just the breath of a man who had whispered to it before he died. Nearly 70 years passed. Rome was still strong, though no longer interested in memory. A new city had begun to rise on the bones of the old one. Roman Carthage. Colonnades, villas, brick domes, wine shops, the kind of place where coins clinked louder than prayers. Where the wind from the Mediterranean no longer carried cinders, but perfume and Byrsa Hill. It had become a lookout point. Some builders said it was unlucky to place homes there. Others said the ground was too brittle. In truth, Roman planners simply liked their cities flat and open, with forums at the center. Teals were 4 statues and shrines, so Byrsa was left alone, mostly except for the occasional visitor. One such visitor was a man named Quintus Marius Drusus. He was not a scholar, not a priest, not even a soldier. He was a clerk, a minor record keeper for the governor's office, sent to Carthage to document any remaining land claims before new property assignments could be issued. It was dull work. Measure a plot, cross-reference names, note whether the land had ever belonged to a Roman citizen, and if not, designate it as Ager Publicus public land for the Republic. Byrsa Hill was on his list. Quintus climbed the hill in the late afternoon of a windless day. He was not looking for anything. His notes told him the area was cleared. No active claims, no structures remaining, but out of caution or perhaps just a sense of duty, he wandered near the slope. That's when he noticed the ground. It wasn't the amphora itself he saw, it was the discoloration. A wide, shallow patch of earth, darker than the dust around it, as if fire had once bloomed there, but left behind no wood, no Suetonian memory. Curious, Cadi, he scraped the surface with the edge of a writing board. The soil gave easily. He found charcoal fragments, then something round, not gold, not metal, a jar. He almost left it alone, but there was something about the way it had been buried. Too carefully to be accidental, yet too humbly to be ceremonial. He took it back to his quarters, washed it, opened it. Inside, he found the stone. Disc first, then the copper strip, then the withered myrtle leaves. Brittle as old paper. And lastly, not the thread. He didn't understand any of it, but he didn't throw it away. Instead, set it aside and wrote one line in his log. Recovered. Vessel from hill of former temple. Unknown script. Possibly Punic. To be examined. He never followed up, because the next day, Quintus was reassigned. The jar sat in the corner of an office for decades, passed between minor officials, occasionally dusted, misfiled, then refound. It was assumed to be Punic, but no one knew the language well enough to be sure. The disc had no recognizable deity, no likeness of Baal or Tanit. The copper inscription didn't match any known records, and the leaves, they were dismissed as detritus. One scribe suggested burning them. Another, more cautious, placed them in a cloth pouch and buried them in a small garden beside a fig tree. That garden was later paved over. Eventually, the jar was sent to a storage room in Utica, along with other items considered culturally interesting but non-essential. There it stayed for more than a century, and Carthage continued to live not as a memory, but as a symbol. Rome's triumph. A warning. A lesson. Every time someone recited Carthago delenda est, they weren't speaking of the people. They were speaking of the concept. But the people had existed, and one of them had placed a jar in the soil. A man with no army, no children, no wealth, only memory. Sometime in the 3rd century CE, an amateur historian named Flavius Aelius received permission to examine the holdings of the Utica storehouse. He had no patron, no office, just a desire to catalog the unexamined. When he came upon the jar, he was intrigued by the disc. He tried, rubbing it with ash to raise the carvings, tried to sketch it, then gave up too. It's faded, too eroded. But he noted one detail. The symbol at the center of the disc did not match any known alphabet. It appeared more like a sealor, a token, not a letter, a mark, something meant to be recognized without being read. That unsettled him. He returned the jar, made a brief note, and wrote, in a separate diary, "There are things buried, not because they are valuable, but because someone feared what forgetting them might mean." That diary is now lost, its contents only known from a later citation. The jar. Its current location is unknown. The Roman archives that held it were raided during later transitions of power, and much of what we know now comes from scattered references in secondary texts, translations of notes, and modern excavations that found nothing. So what remains? Only the question, what message was meant to be preserved in silence? Why did a man choose a stone, a copper strip, a thread, and a handful of leaves as his legacy? Was it ritual, a farewell, or a quiet protest against the noise of conquest? We don't know. But the jar was real. It moved through hands. It was noticed and dismissed, seen and ignored, and still it lingered, like the ember under an altar no longer lit. You followed the footsteps of a single object, a jar, simple and silent, passed over by centuries like dust on a window ledge. But what happens to stories when the thing that carries them is never understood? In the case of Carthage, what we think we know has always been filtered through Roman eyes. Roman scribes, Roman generals, Roman poets, they wrote of Carthage as a stain, a foreign tongue, red, turned ruin. Even when they rebuilt the city, they did so over the silence of the one that came before. The jar, buried, unclaimed, stands as a quiet objection. It was not meant for Rome, it was meant for time. We must return, now, to the first fire too, the moment before the final destruction, when the city of Carthage still had breath, though faint and crumbling. A priest whose hands shaped the contents of the jar. He lived through that moment. Likely, he did not expect to survive it. His name is unknown to us, lost not through negligence, but through purpose. The Romans made certain of it. What we do have are traces, descriptions from Polybius, from Appian, and from faint Punic sources, carved on stone found far from the heart of the city. Among them, there's mention of a last council held in the temple of Eshmun on Byrsa Hill, a place where physicians once tended the sick, and priests lit sacred lamps with oil from figs and olives. Pressed by the city's poorest hands, by the time the Romans breached the upper city, only ash and fragments remained. But the act of burying the jar, it likely happened in those final hours. You can picture it. If you try, the priest alone, or among the last handful of survivors, wrapping a strip of hammered copper with lines carved not in Greek or Latin, but in a flowing Punic hand that even fewer could now read. He selects a stone disc, perhaps from a fragment of a shattered shrine, not polished, not ornate, just heavy enough to matter. He wraps myrtle, once used in rites of purification and mourning. The leaves are dry, perhaps scorched. He doesn't tie them tightly. He doesn't need to. The symbolism is enough, and the thread course will. Twisted by hand, worn but strong, he winds it through the neck of the amphora. Then he places it into a pit, no wider than a footstep, carved hurriedly with a trowel, or even a broken tile. No ceremony, just intention. Then he seals the pit with sand, dust, and the debris of what once was a temple floor. When he stands again, perhaps he doesn't look back, or perhaps he does, just once. What did he hope for? Not survival. Surely, the siege had already lasted years. The food was gone, the water tainted. Even the birds had stopped flying over Carthage. But perhaps he hoped that someday, far beyond Rome, beyond its laws and roads and empire, someone would pause long enough to ask, what was this? Okay, not what did it contain, but why did someone care enough to hide it? He could not control the answer, only the question. And so he disappeared, leaving the language of ashes to speak for him. Later, historians would try to interpret the copper strip. Only partial transcriptions exist today, and even those are disputed. One reads something like, "In the year of darkness, I record, not for the gods, nor for men, but for what stands after forgetting." Another suggests the name is not spoken aloud, but guarded in silence. Both translations are debated. The script was eroded, the copper oxidized. Still, the feeling is consistent. This was not a plea, not a curse, not even a prayer. It was a mark, a boundary between the living memory of a city and the world that would forget it. Modern excavations of Biasa Hill have never recovered the jar, but in 1921, French team uncovered remnants of Punicura burials near the slope of the temple site. Among them were ashes, fragments of burnt wood, and a strange discoloration in the earth that didn't match the fire layer expected from the Roman destruction. The layer was deeper, older, and in the corner of the trench, embedded in hardened clay, a shard of amphora with resin along the interior curve. Trivial to most, but to one visiting scholar, an Algerian-born epigrapher, resembled the material used in religious vessels from the Carthaginian hinterlands. He proposed a theory. The jar was not buried for preservation. It was buried as part of a funerary rite, not for a person, but for the city itself, a funeral offering to memory. And maybe that's all Carthage ever wanted. Not revenge, not restoration. It's to be remembered, not as a warning, not as a ruin, but as something lived, as a city with people who baked barley loaves at sunrise, who raised children with names now lost, who salted fish and read portents in the clouds, who lit lamps that had nothing to do with war. The jar may be gone, but the idea that a person once risked everything to hide a whisper in clay, that remains. It is no longer about what was written on the copper. It's about the fact that someone believed it mattered. In a museum in Tunis, there's a fragment of Punic glass. It's labeled simply amphora base, 2nd century BCE, Carthage, probable. Next to it, a small placard reads, "Purpose unknown, possibly ceremonial." No one knows if it came from the same jar, probably not. But people still stand in front of it, still wonder, and maybe that's enough, because the most enduring part of Carthage may not be its wars, its generals, or even its fall. It may be the silence left behind in the faint, brittle threads tying one unknown life to the long memory of the world. And as long as we ask what was buried and why, then Carthage, in some small way, still breathes beneath the sand. You are standing in a library that no one was allowed to enter. The room is narrow. The air is stale. The light comes from a single, narrow slit in the stone, barely wide enough for the sun to pass through, but just enough to reveal the dust. The scrolls here aren't arranged. They're hidden behind shelves that don't face the door, behind false panels in the walls, behind jars that, from the outside, appear empty. This is not a public archive. This is not even a royal one. This room, if you believe the records that still whisper about it, was meant to be forgotten. And yet, someone lived here, not for days, not for weeks, for years. Woman. With no official name, no formal title, just a single reference in a badly damaged court ledger found during renovations to a church. It was once a governor's palace, double quotes, ... and she who attends the buried tongues. In the room where no foot but hers may tread. That's it. No more than 20 words, yet enough to ask a question. Who was she? And what was she hiding from? The library in question is believed to have been located in what is now central Turkey, in the ancient city of Imorium. Imorium was not always important. For centuries, it was a backwater. But during the Byzantine period, it rose to become one of the empire's most strategic military and administrative centers, especially under the reign of Emperor Theophilos in the 9th century. Theophilos had a fondness for Arabic scholarship and an intense paranoia of internal dissent. Chaos court had spies. His bureaucracy had more scribes than soldiers. And the empire's monasteries were routinely purged of texts deemed inflammatory, a word that, in his time, meant anything from astronomy manuals written in Persian to philosophical treatises copied from Syriac monks. Many of these texts were not burned. However, they were sealed, moved to private vaults, or locked inside state-run archives with no catalog, no visible entrance, and no access except by imperial decree. One such vault, referenced obliquely in an imperial dispatch, was simply called the Chamber of Untranslatables. That's where this story begins, according to the only surviving registry of internal scribes in Amorium. A woman was stationed in a location without official record between 837 and 845 CE. Her listing contains no department, no duties, no supervisor, just one line assigned to CU in continuance. CU, most scholars agree, refers to the Chamber of Untranslatables. This chamber was believed to house texts deemed dangerous to comprehension, that is, books, scrolls, and fragments written in scripts or languages that imperial scribes could not fully decode, and therefore could not be safely disseminated, copied, or studied. These texts were kept not because they were valuable. They were kept because no one knew what to do with them, and so, as the empire warred, taxed, and legislated, a room somewhere in the fortress city of Amorium remained sealed from the outside world, its contents guarded by a woman. His own name was deliberately omitted. Some scholars suggest she was a nun. Others believe she was a court servant. Still others argue she was the last member of a particular translation guild that had been disbanded under heresy charges a generation prior. We'll never be certain, but what is clear is this: she did not leave. Not when the capital shifted its focus to other cities, not when records ceased, not even when the Arab armies descended on Amorium in 838 to raze large sections of the city. Her post continued to be marked occupied in imperial rosters for 7 years after the invasion. She was still alive and still inside. What could she have been doing? Consider the possible daily rhythm of her life. She wakes at dawn, or at whatever hour the slit of light allows. There is no clock, no bell tower. Food is passed through a revolving wooden hatch. It's like those found in anchorite cells. There is no human contact. She is not permitted visitors. She opens the sealed case of vellum, scrolls written in a dialect that hasn't been spoken for 400 years. She compares it to the Coptic lexicon she has hidden under the floor tile, one that was not approved by the scribes but smuggled in during her assignment. Each day she copies a single phrase, just one, onto a fresh parchment, then erases the previous day's draft. No accumulation, no archive, just one act of remembering and then forgetting. She does this day after day for a language that no one has heard and that she herself is only beginning to understand, not for glory, not for preservation, but perhaps for decency. A strange word to apply here. But what else can you call the quiet act of protecting something long after the world has decided it is worthless? Some believe she wasn't translating, she was guarding. Certain texts were considered spiritually dangerous, not because they promoted heresy, but because they were known to cause what ancient bureaucrats called cognitive disarray. A vague term. Some think it referred to madness. Others say it was just a fear of the unknown of any text whose content could not be quickly aligned with approved teachings. One such scroll, catalogued much later under the title The Map of Quiet Directions, contained a list of ritual steps that didn't align with any known theology. The steps were numbered, but they repeated in a cycle. Steps 3 and 7 appeared twice. Step 4 was only written as a symbol, a circle with 2 dots. Imperial readers could not make sense of it. They deemed it non-compliant. It was locked in the chamber, but she may have studied it every day, not for answers, just to hold it in her mind, to keep it from vanishing entirely from human thought. And that may be why her post was allowed to continue, even as the city crumbled. Because someone, somewhere, believed that it was better to let a single human mind preserve illegible knowledge than to risk its return through careless interpretation. She became a filter, a living vault. A person tasked not with speaking history aloud, but with holding it silently so that it would not fall into misuse. That role is almost invisible. No page survives bearing her handwriting. No formal record of her duties remains. No grave has been found with her mark. Just a wall in the lower western quadrant of the former fortress. Beneath a collapsed tower, archaeologists uncovered what appears to be a scriptorium alcove. One wall is scorched, another has scratch marks, faint etchings of letters, some Greek, some Hebrew, some INDECIPHERABL. And in the far corner, a niche, the kind used for oil lamps, but inside the niche, nothing, just a carved phrase. Here, nothing past but memory. Who was she? A linguist, a prisoner, a librarian of vanishing tongues, or just a woman whose quiet conviction held together the frayed edges of memory long enough for the next listener to arrive? And is that listener you? You wake to the rustle of parchment, the scrape of a wooden stool across stone, the clink of a brass lampchain swinging gently in a draftless room. Not your room, not your century. But if you close your eyes and listen to the imagined sound of fingernails sliding gently over cracked ink and leather, you might begin to feel something closer to presence than memory. That's what this woman gave her life to, the memory of forgotten things. In the last section, we explored the sparse historical evidence for a nameless woman who lived and worked in a secret archive in Amorium during the Byzantine period. Today, we step further into the bones of the chamber itself, into the logic that built it. You must understand, this wasn't just a place to store scrolls. It was a policy, a bureaucratic mechanism designed not to protect or preserve, but to suspend, to remove a text from the active memory of the empire without committing the political sin of destruction. 'Cause in an empire ruled by laws and layered clerical hierarchies, even heresy had to be filed. And so it was, filed, boxed, concealed behind blank catalog entries, marked untranslatable. It's a strange word, isn't it? What makes something untranslatable? The Byzantine context. Untranslatable was not simply a matter of language. The empire at its height used Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Georgian, and many dialects of Arabic. There were multilingual scholars in almost every court known. The term untranslatable meant something more elusive, something bureaucratic. It referred to content that could not be framed within the sanctioned epistemology of the empire. Religious writings that used improper metaphors for God, cosmological texts that placed the earth not at the center, but somewhere indistinct, manuscripts that did not begin with the correct divine invocation, or it contained diagrams without liturgical justification. These were not banned books. They were quietly filed away like cracked plates that no one could throw away, but no one wanted to display. The Chamber of Untranslatables was not just one room. It was an idea exported to at least 5 known cities during the height of the Theophilaces. Administrative reforms. Alexandria, Antioch, Amorium, Nicaea, and Trebizond all had similar structures. But it is the chamber in Amorium that became legend, perhaps because it was breached, perhaps because it wasn't. What makes the Amorium archive different is that it disappeared, not the building. Parts of it remain in ruin, but the catalog. There is no known surviving index of what the chamber once held. No shelf map, no ledger of titles, no imperial decree outlining which texts were deposited, not even a receipt. It's as if everything inside the chamber existed without acknowledgement. And at the heart of this unacknowledged archive, according to a single verified report from an 11th century monk, was a single human attendant, a woman, neither nun nor wife, who dwelled in stone as if stone were womb and tomb alike. She kept the memory, but did not speak it. Let's pause on that phrase. She kept the memory. What could that mean? A literal interpretation would suggest she memorized the texts, or perhaps read them regularly to ensure that their knowledge was retained in some human mind. But there's another possibility, that keeping the memory was a metaphor for silence, for containment. That her role was not to understand, but to isolate. That her job was not interpretation, but endurance. To simply exist in the presence of dangerous words without passing them on. To be a final reader and the first erasure. This would align with another Byzantine tradition, the nin mosin, or remembrance ritual. In monastic practice, nin mosin was a form of silent commemoration, the act of holding someone's name or image in one's mind during prayer, even if that name could not be spoken aloud. It was often used for heretics or condemned figures whose names were officially erased from records, but still held in some personal ritual space by those who remembered them. Could this woman have been engaged in a kind of textual ninmosin, reading forbidden texts, absorbing their shapes, not their meanings, holding them silently so they would not be forgotten, but also never spoken? Archaeologists found strange markings near the remains of what they believe was her chamber. Scratches on the inner walls. Not words, not symbols, just vertical lines, some grouped in 5s, some in 3s. No apparent structure, no known cipher. But then was no ink, no stylus, only faint grooves, as if made by a fingernail or the edge of a dull blade. What were these lines? Tally marks? Counting days? Or were they syllables? Rhythms? Some linguists suggest that these marks might represent vowel patterns, a form of memory aid used by early grammarians to track phonetic shifts in spoken texts. Speculative. There's no proof, but the fact that someone marked the walls from the inside is significant. It means she stayed. She stayed long enough to count something. And she stayed in silence, because if she had spoken, or sung, or chanted the words aloud, we might have found echoes in the stone. Sound experiments in similar rooms show that whispering leaves subtle residue, not audible of course, but micro-abrasions on plastered surfaces. None had been found here. She read, she remembered, but she did not speak. Why would an empire build such a room? Why not burn the texts? This is where the logic of imperial memory becomes most bizarre. Burning was final. To destroy a text was to acknowledge its danger. To hide a text was to rob it of power while preserving its existence. Theophilos, like many emperors before and after, believed that control over knowledge was not about destruction, but about containment. A text hidden in a sealed room under a forgotten tower could no longer threaten the state, but it could be retrieved later if needed. And so the woman became a kind of living lock, a password made of flesh, because only she knew which scroll was where. Only she knew how to reassemble the disassembled words. And when she died, no replacement was sent. The chamber was sealed, and that entire archive, hundreds, perhaps thousands of texts, vanished, not by fire, but by silence. Could the chamber still exist? It's possible. Amarim has been only partially excavated. Several lower vaults remain inaccessible due to collapsed masonry. A Turkish team in the early 2000s reported finding a narrow shaft sealed with bitumen and lead, an unusual combination used in imperial times to signal sacrilegious content. The shaft has not yet been opened. Inside, perhaps, are the remains of forgotten scrolls, or nothing at all, or maybe, most fittingly, the ash of wax tablets too. It's fragile to survive. But if the chamber is ever opened, will we know what we're looking at? Will the texts mean anything? Or will they, once again, remain untranslatable? Not because we lack the words, but because the only person who understood their silence is long gone, long gone. The wind over Amorium is dry, quiet and full of dust. It whispers nothing of what lies beneath it. If you were to stand now on the ancient ground where the chamber was once hidden, you might see wild grass growing in narrow seams between centuries-old stones, and perhaps the faint outline of a collapsed wall. But there would be no sign of her, no grave, no plaque, no name, and perhaps that's the point. In the last section, we explored the possibility that the woman who tended the chamber of untranslatables served not as a scholar or priestess, but as a custodian of forgotten knowledge, someone tasked with preserving what the empire could not safely acknowledge. Now, we come to the end of our story, not through resolution, but through the quiet decay of memory. Let us return to what remains, not her body, not the texts, but the walls. Among the most telling remnants of the chamber is a strip of scorched limestone, remarkable to most visitors, but deeply puzzling to the archaeologists who studied it. The burn marks do not suggest fire. Instead, they hint at chemical corrosion, possibly from substances used in early ink recipes. Gallic acid, vitriol, and ash compounds mixed over time may have darkened the stone where scrolls were stored. Too long, undisturbed. This tells us two things. First, the documents were real, not metaphorical constructs, but physical scrolls stored in tight quarters under poor ventilation. Second, they were there long enough to leave a trace, and yet no trace of the actual writings remains. This is important in other forgotten archives of the ancient world. At Qumran, at Elephantine, even in the desert monasteries of Sinai, fragments of texts tend to survive. Carbon black lines on palm leaf scrolls, ink on papyri, faint Greek or Aramaic letters preserved by chance. But here, nothing, only absence made visible, only the echo of what used to be words. Some scholars believe the documents were deliberately erased, perhaps pulped, dissolved, or ritually buried when the empire fell. But others offer a darker theory, that the woman herself removed them, slowly, patiently, one scroll at a time, dissolving knowledge into dust until only she could remember it. We do have one peculiar clue, not in Amorium, but in Trebizond. There, among the administrative records of a small hilltop monastery, is a marginal note written in an undeciphered shorthand. The note appears beside a list of wool donations and says only, "The sand has closed its eye. The woman sleeps." The tongue remains, but no one dares speak it. It is unsigned. No further mention is made of the woman, the chamber, or any connection to Amorium. And yet, this obscure scribble, noted centuries later by a historian of imperial logistics, has been the source of endless speculation. What was the tongue? A literal language? A code? A set of concepts? Or something far simpler? The forgotten words from books now unremembered. We are taught to think of memory as a stable thing, as something you either possess or lose. But the story of the woman in the wall suggests something else, a kind of chosen forgetting, a strategy, not a failure, a slow unraveling of meaning carried out by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. We often assume that archives exist to preserve, but this archive was built to unmake, to disassemble the legacy of texts, too dangerous to destroy and too fragile to survive on their own. And the woman, she was the intermediary, not the guardian, not the priestess, not even the translator, but the space between. There is something quietly devastating about that. Rolled out. To be surrounded by words you must not read aloud, to hold in your hands the work of ancient poets, mathematicians, and mystics, and not share a single phrase, to dwell for years, side knowledge forbidden to all, including yourself, and to leave no record of your interpretation. In a way, this is the opposite of history. This is unhistory, a life spent removing the connective tissue between present and past, not by burning, not by erasing, but by refusing to let it continue. And still, She left something behind. The markings, the wall, the strange rhythmic scratches in the stone that might be counts, or breath patterns, or the syllables of a vanished song. And perhaps that was her final act of defiance. Not to break the rules, not to publish what she remembered, but to whisper through stone, I was here, and you cannot know what I knew. There are other questions we may never answer. Was she a prisoner? A volunteer? Relic of an older belief system reappropriated by a changing empire? Or just the last custodian of an archive that no one wanted but could not destroy? There are no imperial orders mentioning her, no burial scroll, no tax record. She appears in no monastic rosters, no marriage registers, no censuses. She is a ghost without a death, and yet, some say the whisper of her story still lingers in the desert winds, in half-legible notes left in forgotten Greek codices, in the breath between syllables when monks chant verses they don't fully understand. Perhaps she didn't live to be remembered. Perhaps she lived to remember something else, something now gone. And what of the chamber itself? Could it still be sealed somewhere beneath the earth? Some believe it lies under collapsed stone beneath the newer mosque foundations in modern Hisarke, near the ruins of Amorium's outer wall. Others suggest it was a metaphor all along, a construct of memory, not masonry. But if you believe the chamber was real and that the woman once existed inside it, then one final question remains. What was it that no one could be allowed to read? And did she, in the end, remember it? Or did she finally, quietly, let it go? Let it go. The wind over the plains outside Carthage was different after the fall. It no longer brought the scent of salt and wood smoke from merchant ships, nor the rhythmic clang of bronze on stone from the city's forges. It carried instead the acrid taste of ash buildings razed, libraries reduced to cinders, temples gutted by Roman fire, and in the ruins of what was once the heart of a proud Punic civilization. A single man moved through the emptiness, clutching to his chest a bundle of clay tablets wrapped in oiled linen and goat-dash hide. He was not young. His back had long ago surrendered its upright defiance to the bend of time and fear. But his hands, shrinkled, speckled with ink and oil, were still steady, and his mind, though weighed down by ritual and the memory of voices silenced in the forum, remained sharp. He was the last of the Sem priests, the order once charged with interpreting divine will through offerings and ancestral memory. His name is lost, like so much of Carthage, but the Romans feared him enough to hunt him across the sands, even when the war was over, in the days before the final siege, when Scipio Aemilianus had begun to slow circle around the city's throat. This priest had been tasked with preserving what could not be saved, not the buildings or the armories, but the soul of a people. The high priests met in a chamber beneath the temple of Tanit, under columns now shattered, and debated which text to hide, which relics to bury, and who among them would carry the memory into exile. Most argued to burn everything, the ash, then Roman theft. But the old man disagreed. Among the items chosen for preservation were 5 clay tablets, seemingly unremarkably older than Phoenician. Using symbols even Carthage's scribes barely understood. They called them the sand tablets. They weren't maps in the usual sense, no cities marked, just rows of dots, some arranged in spirals, others in straight, ascending lines, and tiny marks between them that looked more like scratches than letters. But the old priests believed they were instructions, or perhaps a path to something long buried, something sacred, something Carthage had once found and later tried to forget. He did not explain what, instead, slipped out of the crumbling city the night before the final assault, disguised as a spice merchant, the tablets packed in a jar of cumin seed to confuse Roman noses. He walked east first, then turned south, always turning, always diverting, leaving no footprints where possible, burning his bedding when he could. He did not speak to villagers, nor sleep more than a few hours at a time. He was not running to sanctuary. He was heading into the desert, and there, the trail disappears. The only record of his continued journey comes from a Roman military logbook, kept by a centurion named Aulus Gracchus, stationed briefly in Utica after the war. Gracchus notes the execution of several Carthaginian conspirators, including a ragged priest of Tanit, found wandering east of Thebes with his tongue cut out. He had no goods on him, just an empty jar and traces of linen. The body was hung for public display, then disposed of in the river. There is no mention of the tablets, no note of any map or of strange symbols. But the execution site, east of Thebes, lies just beyond the northern lip of the Grand Erg Orientala, vast, undulating sea of dunes, stretching deep into what we now call Algeria. It is a place without cities, without ruins, without history at least, as we currently understand it. But in the 1930s, a French colonial geographer named Etienne Delarouche unearthed something odd there. It was 1932, and Delarouche, then only 29, was conducting a geomagnetic survey in the Sahara for the Bureau of Colonial Resources. His reports were routine measurements of iron concentrations, salt leaching, the shifting behavior of dunes. But on October 17th, he made an entry that differed from the rest. He'd been following a camel path near the eastern edge of the Erg when he noticed a rise in the sand, too symmetrical, too regular. He ordered a dig. What they found was a stone marker, half buried, a rectangle of black basalt, completely out of place in a region known only for sandstone and chalk. On its face were faint etchings, dots and lines, barely perceptible. Delarouche recorded the pattern by rubbing charcoal onto linen and pressing it to the stone. The result, when he returned to Algiers, caused a minor stir among the colonial historians. The pattern matched almost exactly the dots and lines on the so-called sand tablets, that had survived in a museum in Palermo. Yes, at least one of the 5 tablets had made it out of Carthage. How it arrived in Sicily is still unknown. Some claim it was looted during the earlier Punic Wars. Others say it was sold to a Greek scholar by a fleeing Carthaginian merchant. By the 1800s, it had been dismissed as mere decoration. Delarouche's charcoal rubbing revived interest. The patterns weren't decorative. They were directional. Over the next decade, scholars tried to trace the path laid out by the tablets and the stone. They were hampered by war, by colonial limitations, and by the sheer size and hostility of the desert. But they found hints in 1947. A team sponsored by the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology identified a depression in the desert where magnetic readings sharply dropped a possible underground chamber. They began a dig, but 2 weeks in, the funding was withdrawn, and the site was backfilled with sand to prevent unauthorized looting. To this day, it's unclear what they found. Their field notes are incomplete. But one entry, dated June 3rd, reads simply, "Layer of red ash beneath stone tiles. No ceramic fragments. No human remains. Smell of cedar." It's worth noting, was one of the most prized woods in Carthage, imported from Lebanon for sacred use, especially in burial rituals. So what was this old priest carrying? A memory? A secret tomb? A record of gods older than Baal? And why did the Carthaginians go to such lengths to hide it, not just from the Romans, but even from themselves? Why bury knowledge beneath the sand, marked only with dots and spirals, hidden in cumin jars and tracked across salt flats by a man who would die nameless and mute? No definitive answers remain. The tablets have since been moved to the Bardo Museum in Tunis. The basalt marker, lost during the Algerian War of Independence, likely destroyed or buried again. Delarouche died in 1955, leaving behind letters expressing deep regret that he never returned to the Urg. But the questions remain. Who instructed the priest to take that path? What did the pattern truly lead to, safety or silence? And why, after thousands of years, do some desert winds still smell faintly of cedar, even where no tree has grown in memory? The desert wind was old by the time it reached the cliffs of western Numidia. It arrived not with rage or grandeur, but with a dry sigh, whispering over limestone ridges and forgotten fortress stones. The hills there did not welcome travelers. They simply endured them. And beneath one of those hills, near what is now the Algerian highlands, there once lay a hidden chamber, no larger than a merchant's courtyard. It contained no gold, no weapons, and no bones, only ash, carefully arranged ash. But to understand that chamber, you must first know the man who refused to set it aflame. He was not the last general of Carthage, though his men believed he should have been. He had no title that survived in the records of Rome or Byzantium. His name, if it was ever carved in stone, has not endured. What little we know comes from a single sentence in a passing commentary by a Roman geographer writing 2 centuries later, who mentioned a Numidian trader who spoke of a Carthaginian who buried a war map in blackened scrolls near the salt cliffs of the west. That's it. Sentence. A whisper inside a larger commentary about trade routes and caravan prices. And yet, this single thread leads us to a story that survives, not through chronicles, but through the landscape itself, through burn patterns, soil stratigraphy, and the pattern of carbon residue found beneath a collapsed sandstone arch in 1943, uncovered by a team of French field engineers. They were not archaeologists. They were not searching for anything but shelter from the wind, and yet they found what might have been the last record of a general's memory, a memory he refused to let Rome rewrite. We must return to 146 BCE, the final year of the Third Punic War. You already know what happened to Carthage. The city was flattened, its streets razed, its inhabitants enslaved or slaughtered, and its ports filled with the ashes of empire. The Roman Senate had sent Scipio Aemilianus to finish what his grandfather had started. And he did. But what is less known is how far the knowledge of Carthage reached, and how much of it survived, not in palaces or temples, but in the hands of those who walked away from the fire. The man we speak of was one of them. He did not walk away from cowardice, nor from surrender. He walked away because someone had to carry the memory, and what he carried was not a scroll, not a book, not a sacred relic. It was something far more inconvenient, a mental map. He had studied under naval tacticians in the Carthaginian port academies, spent his youth learning not just about warships, but about winds, tide behavior, and how cargo flow affected alliances. Carthage, after all, was not a city of warriors. It was a city of merchants, and merchants knew how to remember things: routes, prices, sea currents, the reliability of certain desert springs. This general, whose name has been lost, been tasked with preparing contingency plans in the final days before the siege. And unlike many of his peers, who stayed in the city to fight to the last, he left with a small detachment under orders that would have horrified his Roman enemies. Preserved the strategy, not the city. He made his way inland, away from the coast, away from the farms and harbors that Rome would claim within weeks. He moved toward the arid interior, where terrain no longer obeyed the empire's logic. He rode under no banner, spoke to no towns. He carried with him fragments, burned cloth with oil-stained markings, handfuls of black sand from specific estuaries, and a single amphora filled with crushed cedar resin and bone ashed by the time he reached the cliffs near modern-day Batna. He had only a handful of men left. Most had fallen to fever, exhaustion, or ambush. He was not seeking safety. He was seeking a place forgotten even by the Phoenicians. There, a narrow fissure hidden behind layers of flint and salt. He He found what he needed, a dry cavern facing north, where wind erosion had not yet worn the stone thin. Over the course of weeks, he and the few who remained with him began to construct a floor pattern using fine ash and powdered stone. It was not decoration. It was geography. Imagine kneeling over a flat surface and pouring trails of black ash to represent rivers and caravan paths, lining them with fragments of colored resin to mark enemy fortresses, using crushed red ochre to indicate Roman movements, and yellow pollen for coastal hideouts. This was not a map meant to be read. It was a map meant to be memorized. Each section of ash was fixed in place, with a trace amount of sealant made from the sap of local acacias. It would not last centuries. That was not its purpose. Its purpose was to outlive him. Once the pattern was complete, he performed a final gesture that seems almost too poetic to be real, and yet traces of it remained. He burned his remaining written notes, letting the flame rise just high enough to leave scorch marks on the stone ceiling, but not so high as to disrupt the floor arrangement. The smoke left a shadow, a curtain of memory on the rock, but the ash was undisturbed. He and his companions then sealed the entrance with a rockfall, deliberately collapsed with rope and leverage, using knowledge they had gained from quarry workers and masons during years of construction. And then he left. No one knows where he died. No record to show his execution or capture. But what matters is not where he ended, it's what he refused to erase. And that brings us to 1943 French engineers, digging defensive positions during the North African campaign, stumbled on the collapsed stone wall. The cavern beyond was partially intact. What they found inside confused them. There were no artifacts, no gold, no pottery, only a shallow depression in the stone where someone had carefully arranged layers of carbon residue, fragments of ochre, and what appeared to be scorched bone dust. At first, they assumed it was a burial, perhaps a tribal tomb desecrated by fire. But then they noticed the layout. The pattern was directional, linear in some areas, radiating in others, like a map or a memory. Unfortunately, they did not preserve the site. Wartime priorities did not allow it. The ash was disturbed, much of it blown away during weeks of open exposure. But one soldier took photographs, poor ones, but enough to spark questions decades later when researchers began to revisit colonial records. Was this, perhaps, the long-rumored ash map? Could it have been the last spatial memory of Carthaginian resistance? And if so, what did it show? No copies survive, only the photographs and the scorch marks on the cavern ceiling, which remain visible today. You know how to find them. So here you are, hundreds of years later, tracing the edges of a story built not with swords or triumphs, but with ash. What does it mean that a man whose name we no longer know went to such lengths to preserve a map not meant for survival, but for remembrance? And if memory must be buried to be saved, who decides when it should be unearthed? When you think of empire, you often think of permanence. Great cities carved from stone, statues with names etched deep into their bases, coins stamped with the profiles of kings, made to last, meant to be circulated long after those kings were dust. But memory is rarely etched in stone. It is whispered, passed from hand to hand, like a secret too precious to write down. And in the case of Carthage, when the stones were toppled and the fires burned hot enough to erase names, it was only in the softest materials, sand, silence, that some memories survived. The man we began to follow in Section 1, the nameless general who may have designed the ash map hidden in the cliffs near Numidia, was never memorialized in Roman records, but his actions cast long shadows across an age of imperial dominance. To understand why, you need to see what came after Carthage. The Roman victory in 146 BCE wasn't just military, it was psychological. The city was leveled, yes, but more importantly, Carthage was redefined. Roman historians recast it as a place of corruption, cruelty, and decay. Every story they preserved about the Punic people was carefully chosen to justify the destruction, the child sacrifices, the decadence, the foreignness of their language. It didn't matter how much of it was true. What mattered was that the empire had to control not just land, but narrative. And yet, while Rome rebuilt Carthage decades later as a Roman colony, parts of the old Punic world refused to be rewritten. Traders who had once served Carthage continued to operate far into the Sahara. Fishermen along the Libyan coast still used maritime terms derived from Phoenician. And in the highlands where the ash map was laid, certain nomadic groups began telling stories of a man who came from the city of smoke, bearing knowledge in silence. One such story was recorded barely in a fragmentary Arabic manuscript from the 11th century. Written by a geographer named al-Bakri, it describes a desert people near the Arayes Mountains who claimed their ancestors once took in a man from the sea who drew rivers in dust. The geographer dismissed it as legend, an example of how desert tribes love to mythologize strangers. But the phrase drew rivers in dust appears again and again in regional oral tradition, particularly among the Shawi Berbers, and when French anthropologists visited the region in the 19th century, they noted the persistence of a peculiar ritual. Before embarking on long caravan journeys, some tribes would draw temporary maps in the sand using burned wood and fine powdered seeds. Not to follow, but to remember. Once the routes were committed to memory, the maps were erased. They called it tracing the breadth of the land. No one claimed direct descent from the general. No tribe bore his name, but the practice of ephemeral geography maps made too. Vanish seemed to echo his one surviving act. A map not made of parchment or papyrus, but of elements that would not outlast time unless carried by people. And this brings us back to the ash map itself. By the 1980s, the old French military photos of the 1943 cavern discovery had finally made their way into academic hands. Most archaeologists dismissed them. The photos were grainy, the documentation poor, and the site itself had been lost, swallowed again by erosion and rockfall. But a few researchers noticed something unusual in the arrangement of the blackened markings on the floor. They weren't random, corresponded roughly to a stretch of known North African geography. Not coastlines, not rivers, but inland trade routes, the kind used by caravans hauling salt, dates, and textiles across the Saharan fringe. Even more curious, when compared to satellite imagery of ancient water sources, some of the lines drawn in ash seem to trace paths now buried by sand, but which ancient hydrology confirmed were once seasonal wadis, dry riverbeds that flowed only during rare rains. The map, it seemed, had been more than symbolic. It was functional, but functional for whom? Its creator never returned for it. Its people, if they existed nearby, never retrieved it. And yet, perhaps that was the point. The ash map wasn't made for him or his generation. It was left as a time-capsuling offering to a future that might understand what had been erased. And so, we turn to another clue. Among the items found near the caverns collapsed, since mostly shards of later Roman era pottery and tools, was a small pendant carved from soapstone. On one side was a nearly illegible Punic inscription, so faint it took years to decode. It read, "Sakanu Bal, remember, not in fire." Strange phrase. Scholars debated its meaning. Some suggested it was a reference to Baal Hammon, the chief deity of Carthage, and the practice of ritual burning. Others believed it was a rejection of that very thing in instruction to preserve memory without flame. A protest, perhaps, against the empire's habit of burning cities to the ground. If the pendant had any connection to the ash map, it was poetic. A message from the last priest soldier of a vanished city. Remember, but not through destruction. There is a quiet dignity in that, a resistance that does not shout, does not fight, but simply refuses to forget. And that is perhaps what this general became, not a warrior or a martyr, but a living vessel for knowledge the empire could not conquer. And what of Rome? It's easy to assume Rome won, that the erasure was total, that Carthage became no more than a footnote in Roman triumph. But even the Romans, in time, came to acknowledge the loss. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, noted with curiosity that many coastal villages in Africa still spoke a strange tongue, and that certain harbor methods used by fishermen there differed from Roman norms. He called it the old speech of Tyre, an echo of Phoenician, unwritten, unrecorded, yet still living. And centuries later, when Augustine of Hippo preached to Berber audiences in what had once been Carthaginian land, he complained that many of his listeners held two traditions older than Rome. He meant it as a criticism, but perhaps it was something else, a kind of quiet defiance, the persistence of memory where none was expected to remain. Because memory, real memory, is never clean. It does not obey conquest, quets, slips into songs, settles in the dust. It survives and habits in languages no longer spoken aloud, in the way an old woman might mark the corner of her bread, or how a child mimics the cadence of an elder story without knowing the source. And in the case of the general who refused to burn his map, his memory survives not through marble, but through metaphor, through the idea that geography, like history, can be traced in Ashdod. But perhaps the most haunting thought is this: if the map was real, if it truly recorded trade routes, riverbeds, and secrets known only to a dying empire, then what else did it show? A lost city, a hidden shrine, a record of betrayals no one dared write down. The answer may have already crumbled, or it may be buried, still waiting. Beneath a layer of wind-smoothed stone in a desert no one visits anymore. But if someone, one day, found the pattern again, would they recognize it? Would they even know what they were looking at? Or would they brush it only mistaking it for soot, for accident, for nothing? And what does it say about us if that's all memory is now? There are stories that remain not because someone fought to preserve them, but because no one ever noticed them being carried forward in the first place. Like pollen carried by the breeze, they settle in crevices of time, not deliberately, not even consciously, but they endure. And perhaps that is how the memory of the last priest of Carthage survived. No one wrote a chronicle of his departure. No ancient historian followed his path, but every so often centuries later, someone would stumble across a trace, smudge of charred lines on cave walls, a pendant carved from soft stone, a ritual drawn in sand by traders who no longer knew why they did it. And scattered across these fragments was a faint but steady rhythm. It's the idea that not all things need to be recorded to be remembered. To complete our journey into this forgotten episode of Carthaginian resistance, we must shift our gaze westward from the crumbled ash map to the land of its possible destination. It is there, the semi-arid plains north of the Hagar Mountains, that archaeologists unearthed something in the early 2000s that would reignite the debate about Carthage's last whispers. Beneath the hard-packed crust of a wind-blown ridge near Tamanrasset, local diggers exposed a sealed chamber, almost monastic, in construction. No grand columns, no funerary reliefs, just 3 low stone steps descending into a vault that had somehow remained untouched by the looters. Wars and time itself. Inside the chamber were no bodies, no weapons, no gold dot, just a series of flat, palm-sized clay tablets stacked in bundles. Nearly all were blanked, except one, etched into the soft terracotta. Just barely visible under centuries of dust were a series of tight, precise lines. Not letters, not symbols, it's just a web of intersecting paths, curved branching, tapering toward what appeared to be a central node. At first, it resembled a root system or the veins of a leaf, but satellite comparisons later revealed a striking alignment. The lines matched dry trade routes known to once link Carthage to its sub-Saharan partners before the Roman conquest. But what arrested researchers most wasn't the geographic alignment. It was the central symbol, a spiral, delicately etched, almost an afterthought, a perfect, deliberate swirl, the kind that had once adorned Carthaginian altars dedicated to Tanit, the veiled goddess of the moon and the unknown, a symbol outlawed by Roman decree, a symbol that, after the fall of Carthage, was meant to never be drawn again. So how had it ended up buried here, in the desert, hundreds of miles from the ruined coast? Had it been placed by a descendant, a sympathizer? Or was this the final act of the priest general himself? Not to return, not to rebuild, but to plant, to bury a memory so deeply that it would take 2,000 years of erosion to uncover it. There is no record of a Carthaginian pilgrimage to this site, no legend of a sanctuary buried in the southern sands. And yet, the careful sealing of the chamber, the deliberate positioning of the tablets, and the complete absence of any Roman or Berber intrusion, all point to the same quiet truth. Someone wanted this memory preserved, not shouted, not shared, just preserved. And that raises the haunting possibility that the real legacy of Carthage was never in its fleets or its silver or its rivalries with Rome. It was in the quiet choice made by a single man or group to leave behind not history, but ambiguity. And ambiguity can be powerful because it makes you ask questions. Why did they not write names? Why a spiral? Why blank tablets? And perhaps that was the final act of resistance, to ensure that future generations would have to wonder. That Rome, for all its order and records and imperial clarity, would never quite erase the question of what it missed. You can still feel that ambiguity in modern scholarship, despite growing evidence of post-destruction Punic survivals in North Africa. Few historians are willing to declare them remnants of true Carthage. The Roman narrative holds too strong a grip, and yet the evidence accumulates odd dialects in medieval Libyan poetry, burial practices echoing Venetian rites. Even in the cooking methods of desert communities, salted fish soaked in spiced oil, wrapped in palm fronds, baked under sand, there lingers a taste of something older than empire, but perhaps the real legacy is even more invisible. Not a dish, not a map, but a method of remembering, not through permanence, but through vanishing. A map that disappears once memorized, a route that must be drawn and erased, not kept, a truth passed in silence. This method mirrors the oral traditions that kept so many cultures alive through times of conquest, and yet here, in the desert, it feels more intentional. Less a necessity and more a philosophy, a belief that some knowledge should not be kept in stone. Precisely because stone invites conquest, so we come back to the priest general, whoever he was. He did not fight at the final siege. He did not perish in the flames. He did not bend the knee to Rome. He disappeared with a pendant, a scroll, and perhaps a plan. And while his name is lost, the idea he carried is not that you can resist, not with swords, but with silence. That you can preserve not by building high, but by burying deep. In that you can remain quietly and visibly in the folds of history, even when your enemies believe you gone. Because in every question a child asks about Carthage's end, in every spiral carved where it should not be, in every ritual performed without knowing its source, there he is, still walking, still mapping, still remembering, not in fire, but in Ashdod. And when the wind sweeps across the desert ridges, rattling the scrub and stirring the silence, maybe, just maybe, it's still carrying the trace of his footsteps. In the central deserts of what we now call Tunisia, there once stood a house with no doors. Its entrance was not marked by lintel or threshold, but by a smooth opening in the cliffside and oval-shaped breach worn into rose-colored sandstone, polished not by chisel or tool, but by centuries of desert wind. The locals did not call it a house. They called it the Hala Isara, the Whispering Hollow. The Roman stoics, who eventually made records, called it the Oracle House of Lebda, though no oracle was ever formally acknowledged there, and no prophecy was written down. Even Pliny the Elder, thorough in his catalogues, mentioned it only once in passing, noting that no coin, no stone, no decree marks the house, but people still listened to it. What people were these? They were Berber herders, desert traders, Athenian refugees, later Christian mystics, and, in time, wandering Sufis. But before all of them, before any of the names and flags that we now use to cut time into palatable pieces, there was just the wind, and the girl who listened to it. Her name was Amessa, at least according to the only written document ever found near the hollow, a clay bead necklace with 7 ancient Punic letters pressed into the soft surface. Amaseleb, roughly, Messa of the temple, or, more literally, she who was consecrated. The bead was found by accident in the 1970s, lodged between 2 slabs of wind-blown sediment inside the hollow. It was the only human-made artifact found. There are no pottery shards, no tools, no bones, no carvings. It's just a bead with a name that no longer belonged to anyone. And yet stories about her endured, passed from grandmother to child across countless generations. These stories were never told with the gravity of scripture, but with the boredom of ritual. The same lines repeated at night over cooking fires, the same phrases murmured as dust clouds moved in over goat tracks. She listened, but did not speak. She knew the wind's real name. She never left, only vanished. The more skeptical historians argued that Amessa was simply an allegory, a personification of the desert's indifference, an ancient explanation for strange echoes and eerie silences inside the hollow. But others suggest she was part of something more specific, a fragment of a system, the system of Carthaginian weather-watching priests. While Rome remembered Carthage as a city of ships and trade, the inland Carthaginians, those who maintained Punic observatories in the highlands and deserts, were skywatchers. They tracked not only the stars, but the subtle movements of air. They recorded the shape of morning clouds, the scent of night winds, and the way sand settled into the corners of shrines. To them, the wind was not just weather, it was data, and within that data, they believed, was the voice of the divine. So how does a girl like Amessa fit into this ancient meteorological priesthood? Carefully and anonymously, records of priestesses in Punic tradition are scant. Women served goddesses, and some were votive servants in temples, but few were considered prophets. Most of the known roles were male interpreters, star measurers, sacrificers. Yet, in the inland communities, those far from the ports, beyond the reach of Rome's bureaucratic eye-roll traditions, suggest a different dynamic. Young women were often entrusted with observing quiet patterns, the changes in animal migration, the smells of plants at dawn, the way ash blew from ceremonial fires, not because they were considered sacred, but because they were invisible in a world where knowledge could get you killed, especially under Roman suspicion. The safest messenger was the one no one noticed. A girl tending goats, a girl refilling water, a girl sitting beside a hollow, listening. The oracle house, as the Romans called it, was not a temple. It had no altar, no steps, no iconography. It had shape, a curved dome carved by wind that carried sound in strange ways. Whispered words spoken near one wall would ricochet through the space and arrive behind you. sometimes louder. Times changed, and in that space, a message sat, not to prophesy, but to record, not with pen or stylus, but with memory, according to local traditions. She was trained not to speak for the gods, but to listen for echoes. She was not asked to interpret, only to notice. And once a pattern repeated, once the same sound returned from the same wind, on the same day of the lunar cycle she would walk to the nearest well and hum the pattern while drawing water. That was her message. A tune, a rhythm, carried casually, repeated without urgency. No one ever knew what she was truly saying, except the elder who would hear it and adjust the timing of the planting, or warn a trader to delay their departure. And when she was done, she would return to the hollow dot to listen again. But then, one day, she did not return. The stories diverge here. Some say she followed the storm too far and was lost. Others say she left of her own will, her task complete. A few claimed the Romans discovered her role and silenced her. But the quietest story, the one not often told, loud suggests she vanished into the rock itself, that the hollow, once her listening post, became her voice, that when the wind curves through it today and makes no sound at all, it is because she is no longer listening, but sleeping. And perhaps that's why the site has never yielded anything else. No ruins, no burials, no treasure, just silence and a single bead. The question that lingers is this: if a mesa existed and if she was part of a larger network of silent observers across post-Carthaginian North Africa, how much of what we now call luck or folklore was once structured knowledge? How many patterns did they notice that we can no longer see? And how many of them were quietly buried not in tombs or scrolls but in songs, in wind, in the bored murmurings of old women cooking flatbread in clay ovens? What if the memory of Carthage didn't burn with the city or drown in Roman ink, but drifted invisibly across centuries inside girls like a mesa? By the time the Roman legions were comfortably garrisoned in Carthage, what remained of Punic religion had already begun to dissolve not in fire or blood, but in the quieter erosion of meaning. Temples became granaries. Shrines to Baal Hammon were stripped of their sacred trees. In the meticulous calendars of the inland, sky priests faded into irrelevance. But in the arid lands beyond Thysrus and Sufechelin, the uncharted folds of desert hills, something lingered. Not a religion, not even a tradition, just the faint habit of watching the wind. It wasn't a priesthood anymore. No one wore robes or burned offerings. Tay wasn't even conscious. It was embedded in movement, in ritual, in boredom. A grandmother cleaning her courtyard would pause when the breeze changed direction. A shepherd would wait for the red line of dust on the horizon to break before leading his flock. Traders' wife would sniff the air just before dusk and decide whether her husband should leave tomorrow or next week. They weren't reading auguries. They weren't invoking gods. They were following echoes, and the people who followed them had no names. The Romans didn't record their routes because their routes had no names. No roads, no posts, no milestones, only intervals. 3 days between the last tamarisk and the salt flat. 2 dawns between a bitter spring and the rock shaped like a sleeping dog. This system, unwritten, visible, was not unique to the Carthaginians. It's how most ancient trade moved through desert spaces. But in the Punic-speaking enclaves of the interior, there was one unusual detail. Each invisible route had a song, not a chant, not a prayer. A melody simple, repetitive, and wordless that marked the duration of a journey. A 5-day song would be longer than a 3-day one. A 6-hour path might be only a hum. The notes didn't describe the journey. They were the journey. A person would leave one oasis and begin humming the song. When the song ended, they would know they were near their destination. How were these songs remembered? In most cases, they weren't. Each guide or family had their own variations, but some melodies, especially those connected to predictable weather events, were shared across generations. They were passed down, unspoken, often as lullabies or idle humming while working, and some of them, even now, still appear in recordings. In the 1930s, French colonial ethnographies recorded Berber women singing while spinning thread outside Nefta. One song, labeled simply as Tissage No. 3, contains a 5-note phrase nearly identical to the melody later transcribed from Bedouin singers near Tatooine in the 1950s. The same phrase appears again very faintly in the 1980s, recording of schoolchildren in southern Tunisia skipping rope. The intervals match. The tempo changes slightly, but the core melody remains, and it matches a pattern etched into the surface of a Punic altar stone discovered in 1881, now housed in the Bardo Museum. 5 notches, then 3, then 5 again. Most scholars interpreted the notches as tally marks, perhaps recording sacrifices, but in the context of these melodies, some now wonder, were they notation? The problem is, of course, that without lyrics or script, we cannot know what the songs meant, and without ruins, we cannot confirm their purpose. But that's where the girl returns, Ames' essay, or, more precisely, what she represents in the oral tradition surrounding her memory. It is said that she could find her way through the desert blindfolded, not by stars, not by scent, but by wind. This idea of a person navigating by wind alone was dismissed by early scholars as poetic exaggeration. But in the 21st century, new research into Aeolian mapping suggests that sustained wind patterns over long periods can be perceived by trained individuals as directional markers. Certain wind corridors, narrow valleys, or shallow basins carry a consistent tone when wind flows through them. The pitch can change based on the hour, the humidity, or the season, but over time, locals can learn to recognize them as naturally occurring chimes in the landscape. One such chime exists in the Mont Meta Plateau. Another is found near Jebel Dahar, and a third, now silent, was once reported near the very same hollow, once called Tahalates Sahra. What if Ames's role wasn't only to listen for prophecy, but to map these invisible corridors, not with ink, but with voice, by humming the resonance of the wind, by matching it with melodies she could trace paths others could not see. She wasn't inventing roots. She was recalling frequencies. And here the story deepens, because in 2002, a team of German researchers conducted low-frequency acoustic analysis on the hollow where the bead was found. They discovered that when wind passes through the structure at a particular angle, one that only occurs during equinox transitions, creates a harmonic tone at exactly 440 Hz. That's the A note, the one modern orchestra's tuned to. It is, of course, coincidence. Ancient people did not use modern Western tuning, but the idea remains. Stounda, consistent pitch, merges at specific times, and if you lived your whole life beside that hollow, you would recognize it instantly. Now, imagine a girl, barely 15, tasked with listening, not speaking, not interpreting, not ruling, but simply listening. Each morning, she would wake before dawn and sit cross-legged in the dome. No candles, no prayers, just silence. As the wind stirred, she would wait for the first harmonic. When it came, she would hum its pitch. If it shifted, she would adjust. If it stayed, she would memorize the rhythm. Then she would leave, not to perform, not to tell fortunes, but to walk, to follow the wind's echo until it changed. And where it changed, she would pause. Mark it not with stone or ink, but with voice. A new melody for a new path. She may not have been the only one. The idea of a network scattered across North Africa of young wine listeners is purely hypothetical. There is no hard evidence, but the echo of it, like the hum of air in a hollow dome, persists. And so the question becomes, If a mesa was real, and if her bead is the only artifact ever found, why was nothing else left behind? Why were the songs not written down? Why did the melodies vanish except in fragments? The answer may be deeply practical, because writing is permanent. Impermanence. In the age of Rome, suspicion was dangerous. To be forgotten was to survive. To be erased was to endure. And so a mess's knowledge, whatever it was hidden not in stone or scroll, but in repetition, in humming, in mothers singing to babies who would never know why that tune felt familiar. This was not accident, it was strategy, a resistance of silence, not against power, but against forgetting. And now, thousands of years later, we must ask if we are only just now noticing the echoes. How many melodies have we missed? Tall, and how much knowledge, quiet, unnoticed, unremarked, still lives in the spaces we overlook. By the time the wind stopped, no one remembered her name. Not truly. Not in the way a name anchors someone to a calendar or a scroll or a family line. What was remembered was less than a biography and more than a silence of presence without a position. A girl whose breath matched the wind. A melody that didn't belong to anyone, and yet was sung in homes that no longer remembered the purpose of the tune. But let's return to what we can know. The Roman record keepers, so careful, so diligent, compiled long rosters of goods, routes, and officials. From their ledges, we can trace how olive oil moved from Leptis Magna to Massilia, how grain caravans threaded through valleys to reach markets in Gaul, how soldiers received monthly allotments of salt and barley. But scattered among these neat reports are occasional fragments, notes that don't belong. One reads, "Trade disturbed in the south by women who turn away merchants based on wind." Another, "Desert guides unwilling to travel west of the third hill when the sound is wrong." To an administrator, these entries were nuisances, superstition, obstinance, a failure to comply. But if you step outside the logic of the ledger, into the dry rhythm of the deserts, these fragments speak to something else entirely, an invisible system of knowledge. A system with no temples, no priests, just women who listened and men who refused to walk against a song. And within that system, the girl Amisa, or whoever she was, served as a pivot. Not a leader, not a rebel, a pivot, a place where knowledge passed without stopping. But she did stop. The only reason we even speak of her at all, why she wasn't swallowed completely by the dust of prehistory's the bead. Let us look again at that object, now catalogued as artifact N1421 in the Bardo Museum's collection. A pale, palm-sized cylinder of quartzite, scored with horizontal grooves, so light it barely weighs more than a coin. Found, not during a targeted dig, but by accident in the 1920s, when a military detachment stumbled across a collapsed dome while installing a radio relay point. The bead was ignored. It was set aside, dismissed as debris. It didn't enter the museum's collection until the 1960s, when an intern recatalogued overlooked desert finds. It sat in a drawer for nearly 30 more years. Then, 1991, it was tested by chance. A team analyzing mineral compositions across North Africa included it in a control batch. The bead was unusual. Its quartzite had microscopic wear patterns, resembling those caused by centuries of being handled or rotated. But more than that, the internal crystalline structure showed evidence of exposure to vibration. Not just environmental stress, but resonance. In simple terms, the bead had, over time, absorbed sound. Now, quartz is piezoelectric. It responds to pressure with electrical signals, and vice versa. This property is why it's used in radios and clocks. Under certain conditions, quartzite can also hold onto acoustic resonance, very faintly, very weakly. The Bardo bead was found to contain a residual frequency at 440 Hz, the same tone detected from the wind channel in the nearby hollow. The same pitch that modern instruments use as tuning a coincidence, perhaps. But here's where the story tilts. In 2003, an experimental team attempted to recreate the bead's conditions using similar quartzite. They placed test beads inside a chamber shaped like the hollow dome where the original was found. They exposed the chamber to steady airflow under natural temperature and humidity conditions, mimicking desert equinox weather after 60 hours of exposure. Their test bead displayed the same faint resonance at 440 GG. It would take decades, perhaps centuries, for the pattern to embed strongly. So what was the bead for? Some say it was an instrument, a kind of natural tuning fork placed in the hollow, so that when the wind matched the correct tone, it would vibrate subtly. A passive confirmation. When the wind sang, the bead would remember. Others believe it was devotional, that the priestess or listener will hold the bead in her hand while listening to the wind, the warmth of her skin, the hum of her voice, the whistling air together, leaving a physical trace. But some scholars increasingly see the bead not as a ritual object, but as a map, not a map like we know it. No coordinates, no landmarks, but a harmonic guide, a pitch recorder, something that remembered the wind, not in direction or speed, in sound. To these researchers, the bead was not an end, it was a key, because in the years since its rediscovery, other objects have emerged. Tiny, nearly identical beads, one from Libya, one from Algeria, each with similar wear patterns and mass, each found near abandoned structures with dome-like acoustic properties. And in each case, the bead responds faintly to one distinct tone, not the same tone, different notes, different paths. Imagine, if you will, that the girl Misa traveled, not to proclaim, but to collect. Each time the wind sang a new song in a new hollow, she would wait, she would listen, she would tune, and then she would leave behind a marker, a bead, a trace, not for pilgrims, not for students, for the wind itself, as if to say, here, this place listens to. Why? Because the desert forgets quickly. Structures collapse, names vanish, but sound leaves shadows. A person attuned to wind could find these hollows again, could wait, could listen, and if the sound returned, they would know. And if it didn't, they would know it was gone. This idea that knowledge could be passed through resonance, rather than inscription, is difficult for modern minds to grasp, but it is not without precedent. In many oral cultures, navigation is embedded in chant, movement, repetition. Polynesian navigators use wave patterns. Sami reindeer herders follow tonal shifts in snow. Wind paths in deserts are no less traceable, less visible. So perhaps Amessa wasn't a prophet, or even a priestess. She was a cartographer. Her map was not written in ink, but in echo. And then she disappeared. No records, no tomb, no monument, only the bead. And now, more than 2,000 years later, a final question emerges. What if we've misunderstood what she left behind? What if the bead is not a message, but a message box? Not an instruction, recording dot, and we centuries, too late, strangers to the tonar, listening not to the voice of a priestess, but to the silent response of the wind to her memory. Not when she said, but what the wind said back. If that is true, then we must ask, how many wind echoes have we buried without listening? And what else might be speaking still through the things we mistake for silence? Carthage did not burn in a single night. You may have heard it that wind simplified retellings, in textbooks written for clarity over complexity, But the destruction of Carthage was not a flash. It was a slow, methodical collapse, a drawn-out disintegration of memory and structure, managed by men who recorded their own acts in triumph and erased the rituals of others in silence. By the time the Roman, General Scipio Aemilianus ordered the final assault in 146 BCE. Carthage had already been strangled, starved by siege, undone by betrayal, blockade, and bureaucratic violence. The fire was only the final ritual meant, not just to kill, but to erase. But not everything vanished. There is no known name for the last priest of Carthage. Not in Latin, not in Punic, not in the Phoenician syllabaries passed down on potsherds or tucked away on fragmentary stelae. What we know is reconstructed, inferred from the smallest of source citations in later Roman texts that mention a pagan whisperer, or references in early Christian polemics that decried the desert rites of the old tongue. But in 1897, in a remote olive grove near Tatain in southern Tunisia, a small underground chamber was uncovered by accident. The grove had been cultivated for generations, but that year, unusually heavy rains caused the collapse of a hollow beneath a particularly ancient tree. What lay below was not a tomb, not a cistern. It was too symmetrical, too deliberately shaped. It was a vault, small, only 6 feet by 10. The ceiling low, just enough to sit upright, not stand. But its walls were lined with stone cubbies, 48 in total. Most were empty, but in 4 of them, sealed in small ceramic jars, were preserved parchments. Fragile, rolled, blackened by age, and one, covered in a crust of salt and dust, bore a single recognizable word, mole, K-O-M, a word now translated variously as offering, place of silence, or surrender. The find was catalogued by a colonial officer, photographed, and promptly forgotten. The parchments, those that hadn't crumbled, were sent to a university archive in Paris. Only one was translated before war broke out in Europe, and budgets for Phoenician studies evaporated. The chamber itself was resealed, the grove replanted. A fence went up, then down. The olive trees swallowed the site again, but the translation kept in a private scholar's notes resurfaced. Decades later, a single phrase, carefully transcribed. We wrapped the memory in salt and buried it away from the counting roads, where no tax can reach and no fire will come. Wrap the memory, salt, buried. Whoever wrote those words had no expectation that the ritual would survive. And perhaps it did not in form, not in ceremony, but what was left was a clue, a pointer, an unresolved whisper. So let's ask a very boring question. What would a priest from a collapsing Carthaginian order under siege by Rome choose to bury in the desert? Not gold. The Romans would find that, not weapons. There was no victory left to fight for. Memory, rituals, calendars. The priesthood of Carthage was more than just religious. It was administrative. Temple officials tracked trade, seasonal planting, wind patterns, and sacrificial cycles. They kept lunar tables and scribbled drought records on wax tablets, because they knew when the tide would rise and when the Phoenician stars would return. In destroying Carthage, Rome wasn't just destroying a rival, it was erasing a knowledge system. So the last priest didn't run. He went underground. Imagine him, gaunt, gray-robed eyes, raw from smoke and wind, moving south, away from the crumbling city, into the open spaces where names thin and sand overtakes stone. He wasn't carrying scrolls. Scrolls burn. He wasn't dragging relics. Relics break. He was carrying fragments, words spoken aloud, songs without instruments, symbols memorized, not written, in salt. Salt in ceramic. Salt as a purifier, yes, but also as a desiccant, a preserver. Ancient people preserved meat and salt, but they also preserved ideas. In some Near Eastern rituals, salt lines were used to draw out spirits or seal in vows. Salt was considered incorruptibly like parchment. Unlike voice, the priest may have carried jars not filled with treasure, but with meanings, sand and salt and ash mixed in proportions known only to his order. Each a container for something larger, a chant, a name, a direction, because in Carthaginian thought, names had weight, not metaphorical, literal. To speak the true name of a person or a place was to anchor it, to give it mass in the world. This is why, in some rites, names were kept from strangers, why votive offerings were often unsigned, why grave markers bore titles, not full names. So, when Carthage fell, its last priest likely carried with him the most dangerous thing a Roman could not steal, the city's name, not Carthage, as we say it. That's Roman Latin, but the name known only inside the temple, the name used in rituals, the name spoken once per year, during the Salt Moon Festival, when the city's sacred direction was reaffirmed. We will never know that name, not truly, but we may know where it was buried. The vault under the olive trees wasn't a treasure chamber, it was an archive, a negative archive, nothing permanent, nothing solid. Each cubby was designed to hold a jar, 40-8 jars, 40-8 segments, not of a map, but of a calendar. The Carthaginian ritual year had 48 lunar phases, divided into salt and fire days, each associated with a specific direction, wind and offering, a T. It was cyclical, non-linear. It's time as return, not progression. If the priest was the last to hold that cycle in memory, then he may have created a physical echo of it in that vault. 48 jars, each one filled with the echo of a festival, a chant, a direction, and if the jars were removed, as the vault was uncovered, then the cycle is broken, except for jars were left behind. Why? Were they less important? Or were they too important? What if those 4 jars contained not parts of the cycle, but the center? What if the other 44 were decoys, markers, cret, and the real memory, the name, the direction, the voice was split among the final 4? We don't know. We only know that the jars are missing now, moved, cataloged, likely broken or repurposed, except one fragment remains. In a Paris archive box, mislabeled as ceramic fragment, pre-Roman, undated. It bears an incised mark, 3 vertical lines, 1 broken dot. This marking matches a symbol found on a Punic stele, now in Madrid, Stiat, and that stele's inscription, translated by a young archaeologist in 1983, reads, "Where the wind bends twice, Mary sleeps." That may sound like poetry, but wind bends twice may be literal. In southern Tunisia, there are only 2 places where prevailing winds change direction twice per year in specific valleys, shaped by the local hills. In both of those valleys, no excavation has ever been done. But among shepherds, there's an old phrase, "Don't sleep where the olive sings." Why? No one knows. Perhaps the vault still echoes. Perhaps the name is still down there, wrapped in salt, waiting for a calendar that no longer turns. And if the name of Carthage's true name was buried by the last priest, what does that mean for history? Is a place still a place if its real name is gone? Or can silence be stronger than fire? You're listening quietly now, somewhere between the edge of attention and the pull of sleep. Let the silence of the desert settle around you as we pick up where we left off underneath. A tree whose roots once curled around a chamber of loss, memory. There's something almost impolite about how much history we simply forget, not with intention, but by design. Empires rise not only by conquering bodies and borders, but by reshaping memory. By telling you what to remember and quietly refusing to preserve the rest. And in that long act of forgetting, we lose the slow things, the careful things, the things made not for glory, but for ritual. When the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus watched Carthage burn, he is said to have wept. According to Plutarch, he whispered that this too would happen to Rome someday. Whether or not the quote is real doesn't really matter. What matters is that even in victory, some Romans knew what they were erasing wasn't just a rival power, it was a way of understanding the world. So, what would a priest carry as his city crumbled? We spoke before of jars, 48 cubbies, in a vault, a lunar calendar perhaps, or something stranger. But here's the part we haven't explored. The geometry. The chamber beneath the olive tree was not carved at random. Its corners are precisely angled. Its center is not central. It lies slightly northeast of the room's measured midpoint. At first, this was thought to be a poor architect, or a rushed construction. But when archaeologists from the Tunisian National Institute reviewed the colonial survey notes, they found something odd that offset the room's skewed center lines with a specific celestial event. On the morning of the winter solstice, a thin shaft of sunlight passes through a small crack in the ceiling, likely once covered, and strikes the northeast corner exactly. Not the middle, not the far wall, but that skewed quadrant. And in Punic tradition, the northeast corner was reserved for echoes. Let's pause on that word, an echo. In Phoenician theology, was not a sound that returns. It was a presence that lingers, a residue, a continuation of energy once sent, caught in Carthaginian ritual. An echo might be a chant that was sung in one generation and repeated silently in the next. It might be a name never written, but passed from mouth to mouth, each time slightly altered, each time still sacred. Now imagine the last priest standing in that chamber just before sealing it, holding a ceramic jar. Not with treasure, but with something more intimate, perhaps a pinch of temple ash, or a circle of thread tied during a harvest festival. He sets it down in the northeast corner, the echo corner. Not to be found, but to be remembered, because that is how these people thought of time, not as a line, but as a spiral. Things return. Names are buried not to be hidden forever, but to emerge again when the cycle turns. But what if the cycle never turns? What happens when fire breaks the spiral? Let's return to that one surviving inscription found in a Paris archive. The phrase, if you remember, said, "We wrapped the memory in salt and buried it away from the counting roads." To counting roads, to a Roman, roads were the veins of empire. They weren't just for moving troops, they were for taxes, for census, for enumeration, to move goods, soldiers, and names. Roman roads mapped the world into knowable sections. And Carthage, like so many old cities, existed before roads made sense of the land. The priest wanted to hide something from that logic, from roads, from counting. So he chose a spot not on any Roman chart, a place known only by seasonal winds, a location remembered not by latitude or mile marker, but by story. In Phoenician traditions, locations were often described using metaphors. A place where three shadows cross. It's a place where stone forgets its weight. These weren't riddles, they were mnemonics, ways for oral cultures to transmit geography. And among the parchments found in that vault, one fragment preserved a line so simple it's easy to miss. It is buried where the almond tree hears nothing. That doesn't mean anything till it does. Almond trees, native to the Mediterranean, were sacred to some Carthaginian rites, especially those linked to the rebirth of the moon. Here's nothing is strange, but in some Punic poetry, silence was symbolized by windless mornings, when even the trees do not stir. So perhaps the phrase is seasonal, or perhaps it's meteorological, but it may also be a location cue. Somewhere, there's or was a grove so still, so far from paths and sound, that it earned that name. The almond tree that hears nothing. Not a temple, not a battlefield, just a silence that endures. And what was buried there? Here's where the evidence thins, but the implications widen. According to a 1954 survey by a French archaeologist named Corbin, there are at least 6 known Carthaginian underground chambers in Tunisia, that match the size and proportions of the Tatooine vault. Most are collapsed. All were unmarked. Only one had any contents, but two of them share an architectural anomaly: the solstice shaft, that narrow opening, only visible under specific light, which aligns to the northeast corner. Why? I built in that detail if the vaults weren't meant to be found. The answer may lie not in who might find them, but when that two people who believed time spiraled, the right moment could open what walls sealed. The right chant, the right day, the right silence. These vaults may not have been built to hide things forever, but to preserve them until the sky returned to alignment. We think of preservation as staticus, vaults, metal boxes, but to a Carthaginian priest, preservation was dynamic. It required attention. His memory had to breathe, so he wrapped the city's name in salt, hid it where the wind bends, anchored it not in ink, but in echo. And now we must ask the inevitable: why has no one opened the others? The answer, again, is silence. Colonial powers who uncovered these vaults did not understand what they were. Without gold, without tablets, they were seen as empty holes in the earth, curiosities. But in the 1970s, an oral historian from the Tunisian South Lela, Ben Trek, he quoted several accounts from elderly shepherds who spoke of songs sung to the soil. Not prayers, songs meant to remind the ground. She collected 5 of these fragments. One, translated from its archaic dialect, reads, "Tell the earth what it once held, and it may remember the voice that placed it." What an idea that the earth remembers. That burial isn't the end, but a pause. What happens when we speak those names again? What happens when memory is not preserved by language, but in spite of it? Maybe the last priest wasn't hiding something. Maybe he was waiting, and maybe the silence that followed was not the absence of voice, but its deep, patient echo. You're listening quietly now, somewhere between the edge of attention and the pull of sleep. Let the silence of the desert settle around you as we pick up where we left off underneath a tree whose roots once curled around a chamber of lost memory. There's something almost impolite about how much history we simply forget, not with intention, but by design. Empires rise not only by conquering bodies and borders, but by reshaping memory, by telling you what to remember and quietly refusing to preserve the rest. And in that long act of forgetting, we lose the slow things, the careful things, the things made not for glory, but for ritual. When the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus watched Carthage burn, he is said to have wept. According to Plutarch, he whispered that this too would happen to Rome someday. Whether or not the quote is real doesn't really matter. What matters is that even in victory, some Romans knew what they were erasing wasn't just a rival power, which is a way of understanding the world. So what would a priest carry as his city crumbled? We spoke before of jars, 48 cubbies, in a vault, a lunar calendar perhaps, or something stranger. But here's the part we haven't explored. The geometry, the chamber beneath the olive tree was not carved at random. Its corners are precisely angled. Its center is not central. It lies slightly northeast of the room's measured midpoint. At first, this was thought to be a floor-poor architect or a rushed construction. But when archaeologists from the Tunisian National Institute reviewed the colonial survey notes, they found something odd that offset the room's skewed center lines with a specific celestial event. On the morning of the winter solstice, a thin shaft of sunlight passes through a small crack in the ceiling, likely once covered, and strikes the northeast corner exactly. Not the middle, not the far wall, but that skewed quadrant. And in Punic tradition, the northeast corner was reserved for echoes. Let's pause on that word. An echo, in Phoenician theology, was not a sound that returns. It was a presence that lingers, a residue, a continuation of energy once sent. in Carthaginian ritual. An echo might be a chant that was sung in one generation and repeated silently in the next. It might be a name never written, but passed from mouth to mouth, each time slightly altered, each time still sacred. Now imagine the last priest standing in that chamber just before sealing it, holding a ceramic jar, not with treasure, but with something more intimate, perhaps a pinch of temple ash or a circle of thread tied during a harvest festival. He sets it down in the northeast corner, the echo corner, not to be found, but to be remembered, because that is how these people thought of time, not as a line, but as a spiral. Things return. Names are buried, not to be hidden forever, but to emerge again when the cycle turns. But what if the cycle never turns? What happens when fire breaks the spiral? Let's return to that one surviving inscription found in a Paris archive. The phrase, if you remember, said, "We wrapped the memory in salt and buried it away from the counting roads." What are counting roads? To a Roman, roads were the veins of empire. They weren't just for moving troops, they were for taxes, for census, for enumeration, to move goods, soldiers, and names. Roman roads mapped the world into knowable sections, and Carthage, like so many old cities, existed before roads made sense of the land. The priest wanted to hide something from that logic, from roads, from counting, so he chose a spot not on any Roman chart, a place known only by seasonal winds, a location remembered not by latitude or mile marker, but by story. In Phoenician traditions, locations were often described using metaphors. A place where three shadows cross. The place where stone forgets its weight. These weren't riddles. They were mnemonics, ways for oral cultures to transmit geography. And among the parchments found in that vault, one fragment preserved a line so simple it's easy to miss. It is buried where the almond tree hears nothing. That doesn't mean anything until it does. Almond trees, native to the Mediterranean, were sacred to some Carthaginian rites, especially those linked to the rebirth of the moon. Here's nothing as strange, but in some Punic poetry, silence was symbolized by windless mornings, when even the trees do not stir. So perhaps the phrase is seasonal, or perhaps it's meteorological. But it may also be a location cue. Somewhere, there was a grove, so still, so far from paths and sound, that it earned that name. The almond tree that hears nothing. Not a temple, not a battlefield, just a silence that endures. And what was buried there? Here's where the evidence stands, but the implications widen. According to a 1954 survey by a French archaeologist named Corbin, there are at least 6 known Carthaginian underground chambers in Tunisia that match the size and proportions of the Tadouine vault. Most are collapsed. All were unmarked. Only one had any contents, but 2 of them share an architectural anomaly: the solstice shaft, that narrow opening, visible under specific light, which aligns to the northeast corner. Why? Why build in that detail if the vaults weren't meant to be found? The answer may lie not in who might find them, but when 2 people who believed time spiraled, the right moment could open what walls sealed. The right chant, the right day, the right silence. These vaults may not have been built to hide things forever, but to preserve them until the sky returned to alignment. We think of preservation as staticus, vaults, metal boxes, but to a Carthaginian priest, preservation was dynamic. It required attention. Memory had to breathe, so he wrapped the cities. Name in salt, hid it where the wind bends, anchored it not in ink, but in echo. And now we must ask the inevitable. Why has no one opened the others? The answer, again, is silence. Colonial powers who uncovered these vaults did not understand what they were. Without gold, without tablets, they were seen as empty. Holes in the earth, curiosities, but in the 1970s, an oral historian from the Tunisian South Layla bin Tariq recorded several accounts from elderly shepherds who spoke of songs sung to the soil, not prayers, not invocations, songs meant to remind the ground. She collected 5 of these fragments. One, translated from its archaic dialect, reads, "Tell the earth what it once held, and it may remember the voice that placed it." What an idea that the earth remembers, that burial isn't the end, but a pause. What happens when we speak those names again? What happens when memory is not preserved by language, but in spite of it? Maybe the last priest wasn't hiding something. Maybe he was waiting. And maybe the silence that followed was not the absence of voice, but its deep, patient echo. And now, in this final part of the last story, we return to the stillness beneath the trees. You've walked with us through the ruined vault, traced the shape of salt and sun through the stone. You've sat with the silence of a priest who wrapped memory not in gold or parchment, but in ritual and earth. But what happens to a memory when no one remembers what it meant? In 1997, quiet discovery stirred not in the headlines of archaeology, but in the side notes of a doctoral thesis from the University of Aix-Marseille. A Tunisian graduate student named Kamal Haddadi, studying under an expert in Near Eastern cultic architecture, proposed something bold not about what was buried, but about how the Carthaginians thought of burial itself. He argued that Punic burial sites, especially priestly ones, didn't represent ends, but transfers, the passage of meaning from a spoken world to a listening world. In Carthaginian cosmology, there was no final grave, only thresholds, echoes, whispered crossings. And it's that philosophy which reshapes everything we know about what might have been buried beneath the olive trees. Because maybe it wasn't an object. Maybe it wasn't even a name. Maybe it was a silence so perfectly preserved that when broken, would begin something again. In the final pages of Haddadi's thesis, he references a Punic tablet held in a rarely visited exhibit in Madrid, once miscategorized as Babylonian. The tablet, once translated properly, contains only a few lines spoken by a priest during the dedication of a threshold vault. The lines read, "Let no child of the West find this. Let no tongue of empire speak it. But if the sun stands still, and silence falls for one full breath, then let what is wrapped remember how to become the world. Let what is wrapped remember." It's such a quiet phrase, but it carries the weight of centuries. It suggests that knowledge, memory, even identity itself, wasn't something imposed on the world, but something waiting within it. Now, what does any of this mean to us? Because we live in an age obsessed with revelation, with unlocking, exposing secrets, translating codes, lifting veils. But the Carthaginians weren't hiding their knowledge from us. They were hiding it for something, or someone. And here's where it turns, because while most vaults were silent, one wasn't in. The spring of 2006, a team of amateur historians, working under the supervision of local Bedouin guides near the old trade routes south of Tataouine, uncovered a stone ring that matched descriptions from colonial-era Carthaginian surveys. At first, it was dismissed as a shepherd's pen, but beneath the central stone, they found a void-sealed knot with bricks, but with compacted earth, hardened over time. A single channel allowed wind to flow through, and when one researcher, standing above the opening, began to recite a line from an old Punic chant recorded by Layla bin Tariq's oral histories, something happened. A faint sound returned, not mechanical, not echo, but tonal, harmonic. The vault was singing back, not with words, but with resonance down inside. The chamber was empty. No jars, no texts, only a pit of smooth stones arranged in spirals, and on one of those stones, a phrase scratched in an ancient, fading hand. "This silence is not yours to break. It's not yours." The phrase stunned the team, not because it was threatening, but because it was careful. It meant someone buried this, not for strangers, but for themselves, for their descendants, perhaps, for a culture that no longer existed, for a world not yet returned to its right shape. And maybe that's what the last priest of Carthage